The first thing I must say is that when I saw this week's Met Connect, the first thing that caught my attention was a godly person, the Reverend Aitchison. Of course, it was an invitation to worship highlighting the sermon title and the preacher, but let me be clear, I am not presenting myself as a godly person. But with you, as the hymn says, we are seeking to follow the example of Christ. And I'm inviting you into a conversation about what it means to be a godly person. The gospel text you've just heard is not a confrontation between Jesus and some bad people. It's an account of a confrontation between Jesus and some people who were trying very, very hard to be good people, godly people, and to help others do that as well. Their intentions were honest. The problem was that the godly life of these preachers and teachers, people like myself, had a different shape and substance for them than it did for Jesus. So let's look at that. First, for the scribes and the Pharisees, for the clergy of Jesus' day, the godly life was characterized by a decreasing awareness of ambiguity and a growing sense of certainty. Black and white. For them, the closer one got to God, the more aware you became of your own purity and the impurity of others. For Jesus, on the other hand, the godly life was characterized by an increasing awareness of ambiguity and a decreasing sense of certainty, the complete opposite. For Jesus, the closer you got to God, the more aware you became of both the purity and impurity in yourself and others. Jesus described this contrast very vividly in his story about the Pharisee and the tax collector. And we must bear in mind that Jesus held religious beliefs closer to the Pharisees probably than any other group. The same goes for St. Paul. They were all teachers of the law, teachers and preachers. So in a way, Jesus was poking fun at himself. In his story, the Pharisee prayed with sincere gratitude to God that he was not like other men, thieves, rogues, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all my income. The tax collector, on the other hand, as Jesus described, was standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus said, I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Luke chapter 18. Jesus not only preached that this kind of humility was important, he lived it. He demonstrated it. A man came to Jesus one day and said, Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And before he answered the man's question, Jesus said, Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. Mark chapter 10. For the Pharisees, the closer you get to God, the more conscious you become of your own purity, and the more zealously you protect it against the impure. For Jesus, the closer you get to God, the more conscious you become of your own impurity, and the more understanding you are of the impurity of others, even those who camp out and throw their garbage on our church lawn. Now, the painful truth to which we are so easily blinded is that when we hear that story of Jesus about the Pharisee and the tax collector, it's so easy to react just like the Pharisee did, to thank God that we are not self-righteous and judgmental like he was, but have instead achieved a level of humility for which we're grateful and of which we're proud. As one religious man said, I used to be a very conceited person, but I got over that. Now I'm one of the nicest people around. That attitude carries over to our conviction that we are right in our theology, that we are right in our political views, that we are right in our views of morality, that we're right about the kind of music that is appropriate in worship, and about the kind of clothes that we should wear to church, and about the kind of discipline that's right for our children, and about the kind of art that is respectable. We may have our faults, but being wrong is not one of them. I don't know about you, but for me it feels like something inside me is dying when I let that conviction go and acknowledge my pretentiousness and pride and pray with embarrassment, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. For Pharisees, the godly life is also characterized by decreasing freedom and increasing bondage to the letter of the law and to tradition. For Jesus, the godly life is characterized by increasing freedom and decreasing bondage to the letter of the law and tradition. For instance, the Levitical law required that food offered in the temple be pure and that the priests who ate the food be clean. So priests were expected to wash their hands before they ate. And in time, this tradition was extended to all Jewish people. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with washing before every meal. We were taught that over and over during COVID-19. But for people who did not have in their homes the running water that we take for granted, these regulations became burdensome. So Jesus and his disciples often ignored that tradition as they did some others. Jesus' position was that to the extent that a ritual or a practice was a means of expressing our inner spiritual reality, it was fine. But when the performance of a ritual or practice became an end in itself and became rigid and inflexible and burdensome, it was not fine. There are churches where the order of worship for Sunday morning has been chiseled in stone, and where deviations are not tolerated, even though there might be an alternative ritual or liturgy that might be vehicles for new movements of the Spirit. There's something in us, individually and collectively, that feels more secure with established ways, with bondage rather than freedom. Do you remember how disconcerting it was to those of us who are parents not to be able to lay down the law to our children once and for all about where they can go and what they can do and what time they must be in? And to have to revisit these issues again and again, it was so exhausting and aggravating. But isn't it true that family life can be spoiled by too much rigidity, just as it is spoiled by too much permissiveness? New times and new circumstances require new rituals, new regulations, new traditions. I think that's what our church, the United Church of Canada, has struggled with for about 99 years. New times, new circumstances require new rituals, new regulations, new traditions. And we as a congregation must come to terms with this as well. New times and new circumstances require us to think about what we're doing and why we do it. Some of us, probably those of us here right now, believe that God is best served in this sanctuary when we have one worship service at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. Others of us, perhaps those who are not here, may believe that God is best served when we have a Sunday afternoon service, or a midweek service, or an evening service. More options, more possibilities. Many, though, are happy with the worship committee's decision to leave things the way they are until the Spirit moves us to do something else. A similar struggle exists in churches when we talk about how to staff our church. Do we call one clergy to do a little bit of everything, or will we call a team of people to be our ministers and to do things for which they are uniquely trained? Should it be always the way it has been, or is it time for new traditions? And I'm not proposing one or the other. I'm just pointing out the need for conversation. As the average age of our congregations continue to increase, perhaps we need to have more conversation. Is faithfulness tested by conversation? I don't think so. The godly life for Pharisees is characterized by increasing certainty and increasing bondage to the law and tradition. The godly life for Jesus is characterized by decreasing certainty and decreasing bondage to law and tradition. For Pharisees, the godly life is also characterized by developing boundaries and by decreasing understanding of those outside the boundaries. The godly life for Jesus is characterized by expanding the boundaries and increasing relatedness to those outside the boundaries. In my opinion, the main reason for Jesus' rejection and ultimate crucifixion was his refusal to respect the boundaries between respectable people and disreputable people, between right-thinking people and wrong-thinking people. But read the gospel. Jesus' hands and arms and heart were always open to all, tax collectors and sinners, as well as Pharisees and rich young rulers. It's been a blessing for me the last couple of years to discover new ways to serve God with you here at Metropolitan United. And I'm grateful how open our church is to others. We're always ready to welcome families seeking baptism for their children. We are open and hospitable to those looking for a beautiful place to be married. Many of you volunteer your time to make our sanctuary open and accessible through the week to those simply wanting to wander in during the day to look at the art, to feel the beauty of this sanctuary, to light a candle and find a quiet place to pray. Others of you volunteer to cook and serve and clean up after community meals for our less fortunate neighbors. Don't ask me why, but the kind of religion that seems to be growing in Canada and the US today is not so open, is often a Pharisaical kind, a religion based on fear, not love. The kind of religion that draws a clear distinction between those who are kosher and those who are not, and welcomes those who are and excludes those who are not. The kind of religion where the politics of fear keeps us in line. And perhaps you can understand their point of view and their concern. How can you maintain your identity if you hang around with nonconformists? How can you maintain the purity of your doctrine if you allow in people who question it? How can you maintain any standards of morality, sexual or otherwise, if you have mixed opinions about what those standards should be? I believe Jesus' answer to that is, if you know that you yourself are a sinner, you don't worry about associating with other sinners. If you know your own doctrines are imperfect, you can listen with interest and compassion to those who question them. If you know your own moral views may be faulty, you can consider the divergent views of others. You see, the thing is that Jesus was not so concerned about the rules. Jesus came instead with a message that we don't need to be afraid. We don't have to live our lives shackled by fear of things or of people that are different and the dread that embracing something different will hurt us, or worse, endanger our relationship with God. Jesus came to teach the law of love, and perfect love casts out fear. There's no need to be afraid. The United Church tradition in which I was reared, many of us were reared, in which we still stand, is one that says, they may draw a circle to keep us out, but we're going to draw an even larger circle that takes them in. Finally, Pharisaical religion was characterized by a growing sense of having a firm hold on God. Jesus' religion was characterized by a growing sense of God having a firm hold on us. Those who are convinced that they have a firm hold on God can talk confidently, and in my view, presumptuously, about putting God here and putting God there. People who live with the perspective and attitude of Jesus are 180 degrees out of sync with that attitude. They know that God is everywhere, and they know that God is in control everywhere, in spite of appearances to the contrary. They know that we live from day to day solely by the virtue of God's grace and God's providence, and that our calling is to be God's servants, not God's protectors. And there's a huge difference between serving God and protecting God. The encounter between the Pharisees and Jesus in Mark chapter 7 is a confrontation between two very different perspectives on the godly life. And here's my summary. For Pharisees, you are a godly person if you have a growing confidence and pride in your own morality and integrity. You're a godly person if you have a growing commitment to the letter of the law and tradition. You're a godly person if you have a growing concern to draw clear boundaries between yourself and the people you believe and believe what you do. And finally, you're a godly person if you have a growing sense of having a firm grip on God. For Jesus, you're a godly person if you have a growing uncertainty and humility about your own morality and integrity. For Jesus, you're a godly person if you have a growing sense of freedom from the law and tradition. If you have a growing concern to expand your boundaries to take in those who are different from you. For Jesus, you're a godly person if you have a growing sense that God has a firm grip on you, not the other way around. The challenge, I believe, to me, and perhaps to you, is to become more aware of how strongly we lean in the direction of the Pharisee, and to pray earnestly that God will help us always move more faithfully in the direction of Jesus. Let us pray now with Parker as he sings a beautiful song, Abide with Me, because only as we abide with God can we follow in the way of Jesus.